Hello and welcome to Aging Matters. This is a program that is provided by and sponsored by the Berks County Area Agency on Aging. My name is Ann Barlet. I'm the Public Advocacy and Outreach Manager for the agency. Our show this month, the month of June, is continuing with the Elder Abuse Awareness Month. And our slogan, I think, as we talked about last month, we're going to carry over is that elder abuse hurts everyone. We want to recap a little bit in that what we mentioned about elder abuse. I want to quickly first let you know what we're talking about. Elder abuse includes physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological, emotional abuse, caregiver neglect, self-neglect, financial exploitation, and abandonment. It is unfortunate that we really do have to talk about this issue because it is out there. It's local here in Berks County, statewide, and nationwide. And today's program, we're going to focus specifically on the financial exploitation with my guest who is, I guess unfortunately, first-hand experience in the financial exploitation world. So I'd like to introduce my guest today, Phillip Marshall. Thank you for being with me. I appreciate this. I'm excited by the show. I guess the other word is almost saddened that we have to talk about this. Phillip Marshall has his own very interesting, disturbing public story of financial exploitation within his own family. I wanted to just talk a little bit about his journey through this personal situation and what happened, what resulted from that, and needless to say that Phillip is here because he wants to share and make people aware about elder abuse and elder justice. So again, thank you. For those who don't know, Phillip Marshall is the grandson of Brooke Astor, who was a multimillionaire philanthropist, mostly, I guess, in New York City, and well-known and very popular socialite and very philanthropic in her ways. So we're going to talk about that, and I think that I need to give a little bit more background, if that's okay. I took it from a little bit of snippet, but please feel free to expand on it. I believe it was in 2006, after years of some increasing concern regarding, if I may call her Brooke, her health and well-being and some other issues. With the help of some others, I believe you sought a petition of guardianship over Brooke Astor and her affairs, and from there dedicated to work on elder abuse. The situation was such that very notoriety, very public, unfortunately, and again can happen with anybody, anytime, any status. So let's start in a little bit, if you will. The story was chronicled nationally, and certainly with Miss Astor's renown, certainly caught the attention of a lot of media and public people. So it wasn't something you could hide. It wasn't something you could do quietly to keep it close and within the family. So it certainly became very public and had to go through a lot. So let's, this whole story of financial exploitation eventually culminated, and unfortunately the key situation here, that's the struggle, I'm sure, for you, we're going to talk about that, was the fact that the person who was financially exploiting your grandmother was your father, Anthony Marshall. Right. So I'm sure that all of that was very difficult, and we want to kind of go back to a little bit about, go back in time for us. What briefly were the circumstances? How did you first come upon that? What made you, I guess, those red flags that go up in our mind? What was happening? And I'm sure, again, it was over time. Usually we don't find out one day. So over time, what was the situation? What was happening that thought something's not right? And give me a picture. How old was your grandmother? This was not something that and again, you were an adult person as well, and so there were a lot of, and the generational things going on, so kind of take us back, if you will.
Well, you know, really, when it comes to it, my grandmother's wealth and greater wealth and her age aside, what her circumstances are classic, are endured by millions of other seniors today. Really what happened was that at age 100, my grandmother was isolated by my father, who deprived her, manipulated her, and psychologically influenced her toward really stealing. And his transgressions were fueled by his mistaken belief that irrespective of his mother's needs and wishes, he deserved and could take anything he wanted. And that included her money and her well-being.
And if I may interrupt that, my first gut kind of reaction is that I think a lot of us think about, if I don't know anything about inheritance in terms of the family, but my first thinking is Mrs. Astor's 100, and so obviously she's lived more of her life than her life yet expected to be. So, and somebody at that age who is already, and we'll talk about his stature and his, I guess, wealth or lack of wealth, that somebody needed to move forward at that age to kind of abscond with some much money and not wait for any kind of inheritance. I guess that's my first gut. Wow.
Right. Well, he at that point was an octogenarian. Also, so and so, but this was incremental. But after her 100th birthday, I was increasingly concerned about her. So I started talking with her supportive staff.
Oh, okay.
And really, I'll give you just one example. There's a transaction that raised red flags. And in fact, what had happened was my father, who was cutting back on my grandmother's expenses, had sold her favorite painting. And it was a Child Hassan painting, an American Impressionist painting of flags Fifth Avenue. So here all these flags are coming up and down Fifth Avenue.
Okay.
And the sale realized $10 million, 2 of which my father kept as a commission. After hearing about the sale, my grandmother said, "Now, can I buy dresses?" Which basically, she went from the limelight, center stage, as lead actor in her own life, to being gaslighted, to being psychologically manipulated by her son into believing she was going broke.
Oh, wow, okay. So she was aware that that was going on, and you indicated that. So at around her 100th birthday, you started to become aware and talk to some staff. So they were aware of some things. They obviously saw her in her existence, and she was in a New York apartment or New York home.
Right.
What did they reach out to you? Were you visiting? You're aware of the were you aware of the sale of this particular painting?
Only after a while, only after I started inquiring. And the thing is, just as elder abuse is inflicted by the betrayal of trust, elder justice is achieved through the provision of trust. And this is what's so important, community-wide and nationwide, really. And I had, people think I grew up in New York on Park Avenue or something. It's like my parents divorced when I was, in 1961, when I was, basically early.
Okay.
And we lived in Vermont. And so, but, I was as comfortable on one side of the swinging kitchen door as the other. But that trust relationship that I had with my grandmother's staff and caregivers was critical. Because I didn't really know my grandmother's friends, like her big friends in New York. I couldn't simply and call them up and go, "I'm concerned about my grandmother."
Have you seen her? What's going on? Have you visited?
And in some ways, even though that wasn't part of the isolation, it does affect that, because I couldn't immediately reach out to her friends. So I'm forever grateful for the staff and caregivers.
I'm just curious, so with the isolation, did the others, after you noticed, and you kept in touch frequently with your grandmother, I'm assuming, so when you kind of saw that, did the friends then confirm some of their maybe suspicions?
It took a while to get
Okay.
to actually touching base with her friends. But, you know, that was achieved. But I think a lot of what happens is, you know, sometimes when it comes to chronic abuse, where it's sort of incremental, it's very intentional on the part of the perpetrator, but it's incremental. And sometimes things have to get worse before they're going to get better through intervention. And that's what was happening bit by bit. There were incidences that really, you know, informed us in this way.
And I think something you said earlier about it's the same. I mean, so at 100, you know, how many folks really are able to go out, do the things that they used to do? So is it natural that she stayed home more, that she didn't get out, that she wasn't seen in the public limelight? Well, of course, you know, we make those assumptions. Well, she's 100, it's expected, it's okay. We don't think of them being somebody at that age to be able to continue to do some of the things. So those circumstances also probably were what people thought as, well, that's normal aging, you know, in terms of that kind of thing.
I mean, unfortunately, because my father was in control, you know, he really did isolate her. Here she is living in a Park Avenue apartment. There was a short list, and there were only a few people who could come up and visit her. So her close friends were denied visits. They were the poor doorman who, my grandmother had known for decades, you know, had to say, no, I'm sorry, you can't go up and visit Mrs. Astor. And then there was another thing where my grandmother, or my father was producing Broadway shows. And he located his business office in my grandmother's co-op. I don't think you're supposed to have businesses in Park Avenue co-op, but basically he had one of his, you know, production members or worker there all the time, pretty much as a watchdog. So that's another situation where you can both isolate somebody, but also guard them to make sure that should anybody try to come and help them or even visit them, that they're sent away. And that's what happened.
So she thought, so they you know, we see the isolation. You were talking about selling the painting, taking things that he justified as legitimate, the $2 million commission on the sale, some of the other things. What about her physical health? Was there, didn't a doctor see her?
Really, but after 100, the only time she went out was to visit her doctor. So she did have medical care, but very typically before that, she would go out, maybe even in a wheelchair. But she would go outside and go for walks. And you're talking about somebody who would go hiking up mountains at 90-something. So it's not as though, you know, and once and we'll get to it later, but once we saved her and got her back to her country house, she was out as much as possible. You know?
Alrighty. So we are recognizing bits and pieces of things that are occurring. That social isolation, keeping people separate, sales, commissions, being told that she was running out of money. You said he said. So bring us to what happened. How did you're seeing this? You're hearing all this. So tell us what you had to do.
Well, you know, before I acted, I was filled with angst, frustration, a sense of impotence and betrayal. You know, really, as I watched my grandmother's world that had spanned the globe and a century become so diminished and compromised by my father. And at first, I didn't know what to do or who to turn to. And that's where, you know, eventually.
Well, and I would assume too, you're in the middle. You know, you've got your grandmother, but your father is part of it. Is he really? Is he not? You know, you almost kind of want to prove it one way or the other because you're in that middle boat. You want to help her if it's existing, but is he doing what he's meant to do legitimately? managing those funds. That had to be an awkward, horrible situation to be in.
Right.
And so how long did that,
Well, what happened was, really, as I'm just filled with this frustration, there was really one moment where in one January, and I have, as a professor, I have about 3 weeks off in January. Little did I know how busy I was going to be, because it was right after New Year's. And through the help of my grandmother's supportive staff, I was able to visit my grandmother without alerting my father.
Oh, okay.
And I visited her for what I thought might be the last time. And I'm leaving her apartment really visibly shaken, and I embrace her attending nurse. And we realized, well, we really embraced an opportunity to talk, just as another nurse comes in for her shift. Now, my grandmother at that point is asleep, and so the three of us shared sad stories, concern, and support. At this point, that was my signal moment that spurred me to act. And sort of so empowered, emboldened, and informed by the conversation, I gained permission to act. At this point, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about bystander intervention and how we can all very briefly go from awareness to action.
Okay. And so what was the, your father held the power of attorney? What was the formal permissions, I guess, he was given or not given to manage the affairs? And then if you can tell us what you needed to do, what were who you talked to, did you reach out to law enforcement, just get a team of lawyers to help? Tell us what your steps quickly, if you will.
What happened is my father he'd worked with the CIA in the 50s and 60s, and then he got a diplomatic appointment as ambassador to several countries, largely because of contributions that his mother made, okay? And had been around the world in that form until the late 70s, and then came back to New York and started managing his mother's, not money from a financial point of view, but affairs.
Okay.
So he had power of attorney early. That power of attorney kept getting revised, so the last power of attorney explicitly allowed that person who held the power of attorney, being my father, the right to distribute to himself. As though, and so he was using that power of attorney as a weapon and a shield to steal. And what happens is, I was giving a talk a couple of weeks ago, somebody goes, well, could this have been prevented? I say, really, if you're going to go back, it's not, yes, there are legal means, and a lot of people are thinking about this, and we can talk more, but it really goes back to my father's childhood. And he was the only child of a woman who's all over the world, but all over the place. And they had a loving relationship, but he was tied to her apron strings, and then ultimately more her purse strings. And so people think usually there's an older adult who's dependent on their caregiver or child or whatever. But in this case, my father was dependent from a financial point of view, but also his whole life was wrapped around in his name. I remember reading something, one of the many articles where, his name always was followed by a comma, if you will, with reference to his mother. And so there was the relationship. And so many times, people talk about elder abuse as though it has to do with elders. And the way you're framing this, where this is not an issue just of abusing elders. It's an injury to our communities. And I think focusing on that dyad, and I wish I had taken courses in sociology, psychology, psychiatry, you name it, but that dyad, that relationship, not just talking about elder abuse, but the relationship between elder and abuser is so important because of the fact that families are usually the focus of where this happens. That's so important. But also the relationship in a supportive way between an elder and people who are in their circle of support.
Okay. In the time that we have left, so let's just quickly look at, he had power of attorney, and we could do a whole segment just on the power of attorney and the piece and the change, and when can you change it in the frame of mind. But so you step in there.
This is a little teaser for one of your next.
So when you identified that that's what he had, how did you quickly, you proceeded to stop that? How did you go about that?
Well, you know, our greatest concern was my grandmother's my grandmother's physical and mental well-being. And initially, I really wasn't concerned about the financials. Quite frankly, we were really more concerned about making sure that she maintained her will to live, not her will to give financially. We didn't know how many millions my father had either stolen or was attempting to steal by changing her will or those amendments to wills, codicils, or trusts, and all these other instruments. So, that was our concern. And I kind of felt that financials were our fallback, but now I understand that financials are at the forefront of really detecting and responding to elder abuse, and in some cases, especially when it comes to what the industry is doing with analytics, streaming analytics, there's very rapid response, but sometimes even being able to prevent abuse. But our concern was not her money. Our concern was to respect her wishes, to live her last days in her country house at home, something that many of us share and aspire to.
Exactly.
And the reality is that at the time, I didn't know that about the over 600 national area agencies on aging, or much less the 52 in Pennsylvania alone, that serve seniors and disabled, persons who are disabled, and what you do in terms of helping people stay at home, through all sorts of services, whether it's transportation, meals, and much more. And I think what happens is your work is so critical in helping people stay at home, aging in place with dignity and grace. So I'm so grateful.
Well, thank you. We are too. We have about 5 minutes at the most, so we're gonna talk about what. So the pursuit of you detected that. Let's just quickly go. It eventually came to trial against your father for financial exploitation. You kind of narrowed it down because it was provable, substantiated in terms of that.
Exactly.
And he was convicted of that crime. Unfortunately, he was how old?
He was in his 80s.
Okay. And was convicted of the crime. I know that it was not as simple as we say in terms of, I'm sure it took quite a while to produce that information, to go to trial, to have to sit in a trial where you're protecting your grandmother, focusing on that justice for her, but having to speak against your father and those criminal activities.
Right.
So really basically tell us the impact on the overall of your family, and then we'll kind of quickly end it with some last minute thoughts that you have.
Well, really, what I recognize now is that to be complacent about elder abuse is to be complicit in elder justice. To be complacent about elder justice is to be complicit in elder abuse. And in fact, our silence protects perpetrators, not their victims. And for us today, victims of elder abuse may be strangers, and tomorrow they may be our loved ones, or perhaps in the future, ourselves. So seniors and society deserve more. And this is why I'm campaigning with so many others, both victims, their circle of support, and professionals who do so much for so many, sometimes with so little.
And as you mentioned, our Area Agency on Aging has a protective services unit, and we do that throughout the state of Pennsylvania in terms of all of the area agencies on aging, and they can call us to be able to report that. And I guess in my thinking today, I wanted to kind of say it can happen to anyone. It can happen to anyone at anywhere, anytime, any family, any ethnicity, socioeconomic status. There aren't kind of any exclusions, unfortunately, to that. So as a result, you have been telling this very personal and yet public story as a way to help us all understand that it can happen, to make us aware of elder abuse, elder justice. 1 minute to give one more point, if you'd like to say one more thing to the listening group.
Well, I think just take care and be aware. And I think back to bystander intervention, just awareness, acknowledgement, where we begin to go from knowing to noticing, choose, and then recognizing that we have a personal responsibility which needs to be coupled up with our responsibility or our ability to respond. And that's where what you do every day is so important in terms of harnessing, sort of through this trust relationship, harnessing your resources and helping people who are seniors, but their circle of support who are concerned.
Good, thank you. And remember that you can contact the Berks County Area Agency on Aging at 610-478-6500 should you have any inclination or suspecting elder abuse. Again, thank you.
Thank you.